Awesome. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody here on our webinar about the well-architected framework presented by Netrix Global. Thank you everybody for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started here in just a very short while, probably 20, 30 seconds, let everybody kind of jump in. Hopefully you are ready to learn a little bit about cloud architecture and cloud best practices. That's what we're going to be talking about today for the next probably 45 minutes or so. So with that, I'd say let's dive right into it. And we might as well start with the who's who of who you're going to be hearing from today. So my name is Tom Lilly. I'm the manager of our cloud infrastructure and applications team here at Netrix Global, joined by Chris Johnson, who's our director of business solutions, and Gabrielle Selmy, who is one of our engineers on our AWS team. You'll be hearing from each of us in various different topics today, so be prepared. So hopefully you're here because you have some sort of interest in the cloud, whether you are evaluating moving certain workloads, whether you have already moved workloads, maybe you're running 100% in the cloud. At some point, I think everybody understands that that's where a lot of organizations are going. And probably the number one, maybe number two question that I get asked is, well, how do I manage this? How do I ensure that I can take advantage of these brand new solutions, these brand new services? How can I ensure that at the end of the day, I'm deploying things the best way possible? Because I'm sure everybody is familiar with traditional data center work. You know, you've got your rack stack and cabled switches and storage and your hypervisors, and everybody's used to working with those solutions. But when you start moving workloads into the cloud, it definitely changes. You know, you no longer have to worry about things like physical access and physical security, or things like warranties on the underlying hardware. You no longer have to worry about a lot of those things that you generally did in your typical on-premises deployment. However, you do certainly have to learn or worry about maybe some new things. And that's where our well-architected framework comes in, which is a set of foundations for any cloud provider that allow you to be successful in your cloud deployment. And as we're talking with our clients, we really want to focus on why do we care about this well-architected framework, the WAF, as we're going to be referring to it today. And you see a list of items here on the left side. And really, it comes down to mitigating risk and being more agile and doing things sort of the quote unquote right way, no matter whether you are on AWS or whether you are on Azure or even any other public or private cloud platform. So being able to standardize this environment outside of maybe what you would do on premises, being able to secure it using some cloud native tooling that is at a much larger scale than what you're running on premises, and being able to be informed about what's going on in the environment, what other people need, and what you as an organization want to do to move these tasks forward, to be able to deploy these solutions and take advantage of all of these capabilities that are now open to you. So for example, I work a lot with my clients on infrastructure services, which are virtual machines. And most cloud providers and cloud partners, ourselves included, will tell you that virtual machines in a lot of instances are not necessarily the right answer, just because of the way that they operate and the additional overhead. You'll actually hear more about that later from Chris as he talks about it. However, there are certain situations where that may make sense. And being able to be informed and understand where these services make sense and the trade-offs and pros and cons and why you should use one service over another are very important. And then once you get to the point where you can and are deploying those services, the question then becomes, how do I do it? Because deploying a platform service, we'll say maybe a relational database as an example, or a front-end web app, is very different than managing your own LAMP stack. It's very different from managing your own PostgreSQL server. So we want to ensure that as you're deploying these services, that you are doing so per best practices. And that's going to come from the cloud provider, and that's going to come from partners like us, and that's going to come from your own intrinsic knowledge about yourselves and your organization. But enough about the high level stuff. Let's talk a little bit about what the well-architected framework is. So we split the well-architected framework into 5 major pillars plus a 6th, which Gabby will talk about later. And you can see the 5 pillars here. We have security, we have operational excellence, we have reliability, we have performance efficiency, and then we have probably one of the most important ones of cost optimization. We're going to be diving into each one of these individual pillars at the as we go through this presentation. So don't worry, we're going to talk definitely more about them. Well, one thing to understand is that all of these five pillars all work together. They all interplay, they all work off of each other to ensure that as you are working through one pillar, the decisions you make there are also going to affect other pillars. So, for example, reliability and performance efficiency go very well hand in hand about how you design and how you recover your applications or how you make them highly available, whether it's active, 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 passive. Cost optimization and operational excellence go hand in hand, for example, because you want to ensure that as you're optimizing your costs, as you are reducing your spend or maybe even increasing your spend, that you're using those decisions and you're making the best out of your budget and what you want to as an organization leverage within the cloud. And obviously security is an underpinning for everything that we do, whether it's on premises or whether it is in the cloud. I think we can all agree on that. And hopefully if you don't, well, let's have a talk, because security is one of the major things that we certainly like to talk about here at Netrix. So these five pillars are really what we're going to be focusing on today. As I mentioned before, we're going to go through them each one by one. And I am going to start by talking through the security pillar. Now, the security pillar, as I mentioned before, is something that is near and dear to my heart. I think everybody here has an understanding or a remembrance of various we'll call them events that have happened, whether it's open S3 buckets that expose databases on AWS, whether it's open RDP ports to the internet that expose virtual machines, or worst case scenario, even things like privileged workstations or domain controllers, or even things like firewalls. At the end of the day, security is extremely important as we start talking about how we leverage the cloud and we design these pillars. And we bring this up specifically because security in the cloud is something that is very different. As we, rather than installing agents on virtual machines and rather than taking all my data into a SIM log aggregator and doing correlation, now I've got a spate of other tools that I can now actually use to manage and monitor the security of my environment. Whether these are cloud native tools, whether that's extension of on-premises tools, there are many, many different solutions, all to meet an organization's needs. And really, when we start talking about security, it's all about protection. And because of the shared responsibility model, a lot of times we're talking about data protection. So as I move data into the cloud, as I access data in the cloud, as I allow my partners or my customers or my partners to access this data, how do I ensure that it is secured? And that's really what security in the cloud comes down to. Because at the end of the day, you don't have to worry about physical security. That's one of the good things about moving to the cloud. So people getting into those data centers and having physical access to those servers is not really anything you have to worry about. So that means you can take all of that time and effort and money at the end of the day and put that toward more data security principles. The other thing that we highly recommend is generally referred to as defense in depth. Is sure, you can have edge security, but then if somebody breaches that edge, what do I do next? How do I protect lateral movement from from one service to another? How do I prevent data exfiltration? How do I monitor for data exfiltration? All of these things really fit into that security pillar. And it's something that hopefully everybody is thinking about, not just once again for their public cloud solutions, but also for their private cloud and on-premises solutions. As an example, we actually worked with a company who was really concerned about offboarding users and really worried about what's known as identity and access management, or IAM. So as most of you are probably well aware, breached user accounts are one of the main ways of security breaches. And a major target of that are user accounts that were never set up and never configured properly. If a user never gets onboarded, they never register for multi-factor authentication, for example, then their account could actually be left wide open. And that was a major concern with various clients of ours, but this one specifically who focuses on public utilities. So what we did is we actually helped them identify not only a technical process, but actually a business policy that went along the lines of being able to onboard and offboard accounts appropriately, and not just into core services like Active Directory, but also third-party applications, because obviously your data is going to be living there as well. And then also ensuring that we implemented a least privilege model. So ensuring that if somebody does need access to data or somebody requests access to that data, that they only get access to what they need. The worst thing that you can essentially have is an overprivileged user, and then that user gets breached, and now all of your data versus just what they had access to is potentially compromised or could be compromised. So we were able to successfully work with this client to ensure that they were able to implement not only the technical but those business processes and work within their teams to work to create those onboarding policies and technical integration where we could. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Chris Johnson to talk a little bit about operational excellence. Chris?
Thank you, Tom. So operational excellence in the cloud, it's a little bit different, as Tom mentioned, because you don't have full control over the infrastructure your code is running on. You have control of a lot of aspects of it, but at the end of the day, your code is running on someone else's servers. And so having operational excellence and procedures and documentation and logging and monitoring and alerting is critical for cloud workloads because of this. And it's also critical because modern applications, especially those that are running on cloud platform as a service, they're distributed. They're no longer monolithic. You no longer have one log sync that you can just open up and trace an entire execution through. You have multiple layers and they're going through multiple paths layers of the application. So having a consistent logging strategy with distributed trace and monitoring alerting becomes much more critical. So I'm going to talk about this in context of a customer example that we have. You can see that over on the right of this slide. But at a high level, this was a business critical audit platform. We built it for one of our clients, happens to be a big four firm. And the audience was huge, 400,000 plus users. And so when you look at cloud operations, you have SLAs that you have to maintain. And in order to achieve that 3 nines, or maybe in some cases 4 nines SLA, in addition to designing your application to scale, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the performance side of things, but you have to have the amount of redundancy and high availability built in. But beyond that, you have to have operational processes and monitoring and logging in place that allows you to act quickly and efficiently and refine your process as you maintain this application. And so the result of that is you have all of your source, all of your infrastructure, all of your application code living in a repo that can be deployed in a single pipeline execution. You can seed your sample data. You can have your operations and dev teams gain this end-to-end visibility of the entire platform runtime. And that's really critical because as these distributed components of the application each do their job, being able to trace an error through each component of that and then identify a root cause is critical. And so leveraging some application performance monitoring and application mapping components from monitoring solutions are really critical there. So as you look at the design principles for operational excellence, the first two focus mostly on DevOps and GitOps. Your infrastructure is defined as code. This allows you to quickly stand up and tear down every single environment that you have. It also allows you to have complete parity between your upper environments. So you know that your staging environment is 100% identical to your production environment. And that as you make changes to one, you can ensure that those changes are deployed identically to the other. This is critical because how many times have you been in a scenario where you go to deploy to one environment and you realize some configuration is different between your test and your staging environment, your staging and your production. And it's not just infrastructure, it's configuration around your application and your infrastructure that combines to make your application lifecycle environments. This third and fifth are much more procedural. Putting processes in place to consistently refine your operations procedures. Your support, how you detect anomalies or errors and what you do for them. That has to be a process. It has to have the right people who are trained on your application, but it also has to have the right components in place to detect alerts, or sorry, to detect anomalies, to alert the appropriate operations team that something happened, and then to automate the process by which we can actually solve for that issue. Um, and that sort of gets into number 4, which is anticipating failure. Modern cloud applications need to anticipate that things are going to fail, that distributed components of the application will go down, not because they will, but because if they do, you have to react appropriately. And that gets beyond simply having um, good architecture and design patterns in your code. Uh, Having a fully distributed application means that any component of the application needs to be able to handle an issue and needs to be able to handle the other components going down and continue to do its job. But beyond that, there are a couple of things that we were able to put in place that really provided some cover in operational excellence to the operation team. One of them is monitoring and alerting, setting thresholds that say if I start to see this particular error, I want to alert the operations team. And beyond that, when I see that error, go and create a bug in the Azure DevOps board for this particular application and have that bug contain the stack trace of when that error happened. Beyond that, integrating with some sort of an application performance monitoring platform or an application mapping platform such as Azure Monitor. There are plenty of other ones out there, allows us to actually see and trace specific operations within the application, including ones that we custom name for actual business operations that take place in the application, trace them all the way through every layer and distributed component of that application so that we can actually identify a root cause. And so, the end of the day, this application not only maintains that SLA because the architecture is designed to take advantage of the cloud infrastructure, um, but your operations team is able to effectively and efficiently handle the errors that are inevitably going to occur. So I'm going to move into reliability, which sort of goes hand in hand with operational excellence. And we'll use a different example, also from the same client, but a different project, an application that we built for them. When we talk about reliability, the the idea of reliability is resiliency and failover in the case of some sort of geographic or regional outage. Um, but beyond that, it's the idea of scaling and to understand the necessary capacity of your application so that as your application matures and as maybe the user base grows, you can be uh, you can be confident that your application is going to remain reliable. This means building resiliency and availability into your apps by understanding who's going to be using the application. Where are those users going to be using the application? Are they going to all be centralized within a single global region? Are they going to be distributed across multiple geographic regions within the United States, or is the application global in scale? And especially for large scale applications, um, understanding the concept of availability zones, of regional failover, and what the capabilities of different platform as a service components of your applications provide, and what those you get out of the box versus what you have to configure or stand up. So I'll give you an example. We built a we built this application for our client that is it's essentially an API and eventing platform. So think API management, but with a little bit of custom capabilities on top of it, and event delivery. So think like an event grid, something like that. Again, with a little bit more custom components built on top of it. And this needed to be fully globally reliable. So we needed to hit an SLA of 3 nines was the requirement, and this had to be not only redundant within our particular region, so redundant within the United States, but it also had to be redundant across multiple regions. So we actually ended up deploying to the US, to Europe, and to Australia. And so as we looked at what the configuration of the various platform as a service capabilities would need to have in order to remain reliable across regions and across geographies like this, we had to consider how the particular PaaS service that we were using would answer that question. For some services, it's very easy. Azure Event Grid gives you essentially redundancy across regions and provides failover instructions and operational recommendations for what happens when there's a failover. But a lot of the technical handling of that failover is handled automatically by the platform. Azure API Management, which was another PaaS component that we built on top of for this application, has a different approach. It is redundant across availability zones, but in order to build in redundancy across regions, you have to actually stand up an additional instance. So when we talk about cost optimization, that's always going to be a conversation that you're having. In this case, we have to run 2 instances of this PaaS platform, or 3 eventually, for a number of reasons. One, because if we want to fail over to a second individual region, we have to have an instance of this running with the same configuration as the one that was running in stateside. The second might be for performance capabilities. So for example, from an API management perspective, I may want to use something like Traffic Manager to route API requests to the closest possible instance of this API gateway. And then behind that has to also be a regionally deployed instance of the API that I'm accessing. But the point being, we have to have conversations about the requirements for the application and what that means for redundancy and scalability across regions. With that, I'm going to go and hand this over to Gabriel, who is going to talk us through performance efficiency and cost optimization. So thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you, Chris. Let's continue now with the next pillar, performance efficiency. As Tom and Chris shared with us, we need to think about using cloud resources efficiently so that the workload meets the user performance, demands, and scale when required. You can hear that we say some keywords: infrastructure as a code, monitoring, disaster recovery, continuous deployment, tracing different layers, awareness of the team, and integrations of all the areas of the organization. Since demand can change over time, architectural design decisions should allow the flexibility to incorporate new services that can increase the performance efficiency and evolve over time. The cloud is continually changing, and the challenge to achieve this goal invites us organizations to embrace the ability and emerging new technologies as fully managed services. We need to take in mind that reducing the managed burden will help the company to not just make less cost in all the services that we use, but also when we think in performance efficiency, we need to think in all the serverless architectures that are available for us and how to enable and scale reduce operational overhead. Constantly experiment with new techniques, configurations, instance types, and several services. We also leverage a global footprint of location and regions to reach their customers. Also, let's take a look at just one typical example of this pillar, for example. When we started analyzing resources and network on a customer in the financial service area, we took a deep look at metrics and transactions. While understanding the services and technologies that the cloud offers us in this area, we realized there is a better way and path to deliver content to the end user. In this case, they were using traditional service and methodologies of on-premise data centers with basic configurations and networking, with load balancer and just some cache. So we changed the delivery content to edge location service. Edge location service are AWS data centers designed to deliver services with the lowest latency possible, helping our customer to deliver 40% faster and improving the response of each connection to their core application. Just thinking on how to be global more quickly. In Azure Cloud, you have the same service too. In addition to this point and experimenting with serverless infrastructure, new opportunities appeared to apply better politics and setting on storage and how data was managed. This was another key point that helped to decrease by 20% of queries made to the databases and allow them to get the right size for their needs. Now remember that we leave a footprint when we consume more resources of energies. Well, performance efficiencies also show us the path to sustainability and invite us to learn new ways and technologies that reduce our footprint on carbon emissions by consuming less. This will be the next pillar that accompany on the 5 pillars that just Tom shared with us in the beginning. So what else can we find when we consume less? Our next pillar, that is cost optimization. Remember that cost optimization pillar includes the ability to run systems to deliver business values at the lowest price point, providing an overview of the same principle, best practices, and questions. Imagine all the customers and different scenarios that are present in the cloud. Well, when cloud providers made this well-architected framework, they realized that there is a lack of awareness and visibility on how organizations manage and follow the expenses on the cloud. By implementing cloud financial management and adopting a consumption model, we can get more visibility and awareness through better practices like tagging resources, establishing tracking mechanisms and dashboard alerts for events involving budget changes. Understanding, we need to keep an instance or service running with full service 24 servers or when it's only required, as well as lowering the cost and consumption of those services. For this pillar, we have an example that shows us how important this is. There was a critical case where a customer had a large quantity of data and objects under S3 buckets, around 58 terabytes, and several services and resources on the AWS cloud that were using these terabytes. They noticed that they had to pay more monthly because that data was growing and they had backups and cold storage for that. So they believed this was normal behavior in the cloud, and the cloud was just expensive. But the main question they asked is why do we pay so much for this data in our production account when we have just 1 terabyte of data in our development account, since they were similar? So this happened for several months until we could run the well-architected framework assessment with them in this client. By analyzing the consumption model and implementing financial management, we were able to discover a misconfiguration on the S3 buckets, where the standard procedure was to remove a certain quantity of data by policy. Still, it was never released on the backup side. Imagine, they have 70% unnecessary use storage to pay per month. Well, when adjusting this configuration, cost went down almost 45% on the account per month because it needed more awareness and a structure of essential services that impact the performance. Similar to this, another example in the same area is to understand what kind of format and setting we use on our infrastructure. Talking about storage and disk, there are different options, but do you know, for example, that with GPT-3 volumes, you can provision inputs and outputs and through output independently without increasing storage size at cost up to 20% lower than GPT-2 or others? Well, these key points make big impacts in your cost optimization. Again, not just on our budget and the way we optimize costs, but on the carbon footprint we generate. By optimizing costs, we also became more sustainable and responsible. Now, let's take a look at how we can review these pillars on the cloud. And Azure and AWS Cloud provide a tool that helps us to understand some of the points that we are talking about today. Remember, let's bear in mind that they have analyzed all the different scenarios and infrastructure over the years, developing a framework. With this framework, a set of questions to help understand the risk of not applying the best practices. On the AWS side, they offer a set of questions to different lenses. It depends on the scenario that you have, whether you have serverless architecture or a traditional one. By selecting one kind of lens, you will get questions and options that will give you an idea about the risk that you may have in your cloud infrastructure. So then you can follow up with an expert and apply the necessary remediations. Now, Tom will share with us how the report tool works on the Azure cloud.
Yeah, thank you for that. And as Gabby mentioned, the capabilities between AWS and Azure in terms of reporting on the well-architected framework are very similar. So on the Azure side, we have two tools that we generally use. One is built into the Azure portal, and we refer to it as Azure Advisor. So what Azure Advisor does is it takes a look at how you are deployed, what's deployed in their configurations, and then gives you a numeric score, as well as gives you a set of recommendations to better align with the well-architected framework. So you can actually see what has been deployed and get some information. This does also include cost savings, by the way. A lot of people think it counterintuitive for cloud platform providers to, tell you how to save money on the cloud, because they think that, these Microsoft and Amazon just want your money, and that's not the case. They want you to be successful because that means you're going to keep using the platform and gain some value out of it. To go deeper into some of these workloads, Azure also has what's known as Azure Well-Architected Reviews, which we refer to as AWARs. This is an actual website that you can go to, and it prompts you with questions to say, did you configure this? Did you configure that? And you can specify which pillars you want it to focus on. Do you just care about cost optimization? Do you want to go through all five, or just a subset? And then it will then give you these recommendations to say that you are good in certain areas and you have room for improvement and growth in others. So if you're not using these tools today, we highly recommend that you implement some sort of regular review of them, especially for newly deployed services, and as you are changing your cloud landscape. In addition to technical tooling, we also have our capabilities here as a partner to help our clients with their well-architected requirements and our methodology that we can apply to that. And that really focuses down into four primary phases. We have assess, we have plan, we have deploy, and then we have manage and run. So the important thing to keep in mind here is that we always want to start with an assessment. This is us talking to you, it's reviewing your environment, it's ensuring that as we make recommendations that we know why we're making these recommendations, that they make sense for your teams, that your teams understand why we are even there. After that, we like to talk about a little bit of planning, which is actually taking pen to paper and saying, okay, we see this is your primary pain point, this is how we suggest that you solve it. Maybe costing is an issue, and we recommend purchasing reservations or downsizing resources or turning them off when they're not used. Maybe performance is an issue. We actually recommend the opposite of sizing up resources. The goal there is to identify that plan and then work with you and your teams to ensure that, once again, you know what's going on and why we're making recommendations. And anything that we implement is not done without any authorization, because we always want to make sure that you're always on the same page. Once we get to that point, we can actually go through and deploy everything and make sure it is secured. Obviously, security, as I mentioned before, is kind of a big deal. So ensuring that we check everything as code, as Chris was talking about. We want to make sure we size everything appropriately from a performance perspective and a cost optimization perspective. The goal is that we want to deploy these things per best practices the first time around. And you know what? Sometimes it doesn't happen. Requirements change, requirements are misunderstood, or sometimes just things happen. So we always want to be able to go back and even amend the deployments that we did through our manage and run. So that's our capability of going back and making changes and adjusting the environment to tweak it and actually have it work for what you need as an organization. And once again, how do we get disaster recovery? How do we get multi-regional capabilities? And that's where our managed services staff can help augment yours to say, okay, well, maybe you don't have a staff that can follow the sun. Let's use Netrix's to do so. And we have a full staff that does follow the sun, that's well-trained in both AWS and Azure to help our clients do so. We also have a couple offerings down at the bottom if you are interested in implementing the well-architected framework for either AWS or Azure. We have what we refer to as our robotized control tower, which is our capability of automating and essentially putting guardrails around an AWS set of accounts and ensure that what you do deploy into AWS matches those 5 pillars as best as possible. On the Azure side, we have the exact same thing called Azure Landing Zones, and that is our capability of taking a management hierarchy comprised of multiple management groups and subscriptions, and then also putting those guardrails around that using tools like Azure Policy and role-based access control to ensure that those are deployed per best practices. So next steps. What can you do today? So The first is identifying some of the recommendations out of the well-architected framework that are very important to implement. Generally, these are things that are low effort. Maybe they take just a little bit of time, but they're going to have a major impact on the environment. All of these recommendations are different per company. I wish I could tell you the ones that we always see that always fit this bill, but we can't. Everybody is a little bit different when it comes to that. But there are always a set of recommendations that tend to fit into those categories. So what we recommend is look at the tooling that Gabby and I were talking about earlier for both AWS and Azure, and start to identify those recommendations that make sense for you as an organization. Also highly recommend taking a look at your existing tooling and gaining that better visibility into your infrastructure, whether it's shifting from portal deployments to infrastructure as code, whether it is implementing some sort of architecture review board if you don't have one already. Maybe it's just researching what the various tenets are of the well-architected framework by rewatching this video or engaging with us. There are a lot of things that you can do to ensure that your infrastructure is deployed per best practices. And let's be honest, not just your infrastructure, but other services that you deploy on top of your cloud, whether they are platform services, infrastructure services, or even software as a service capabilities. But if you're interested in talking a little bit more with us, then please feel free to reach out to us at info@netrixlc.com, and we will get you in touch with one of our experts. Who knows, might be one of the three of us that are on this webinar. Or you can also go to the landing page of this webinar to get more information about an assessment. So with that, that is the last content that we had to present. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to any questions. If anybody has any questions that you want to ask or have been afraid to ask, please feel free to put them in the question box and we will look to address them. So I'm going to go on mute as we wait for a couple to come in, and we'll see what we have to work with.
One question that we get a lot, so until we get real questions, I'll add some that we get frequently from our clients. One that we get a lot is, do I need to get 100% on these well-architected framework reviews? So as Tom mentioned, these tools are publicly available, right? They are built for experts. They're built for companies or people with capabilities like Netrix to come in and perform these assessments. But I would highly recommend that if you have workloads in the cloud and you want to just sort of score these to get an idea of where you stand, to go use them. Go just Google the AWS well-architected framework review, or Google the Microsoft Azure well-architected framework review, and see what your score comes to. You do not need to score 100% to be in the green. In fact, I think they consider like an 80% or something like that in the green. I don't remember exactly what it is. But they will give you, as a result of this, they will output recommendations, and at that point, that's when, whether you feel comfortable acting on those recommendations yourselves or bringing someone like Netrix in, that'll be your decision. But I would definitely encourage you to go and perform that evaluation on your workloads that are already deployed to the cloud, and don't feel bad if you don't hit 100%. I've yet to see one hit 100%, even that we've architected from scratch, because there are certain things that recommendations from Microsoft or from Amazon that are, maybe they're cost prohibitive, or maybe they're just not something that is as high of a priority to you as the framework believes they are. However, if you're in the 25 or 50%, then you might want to consider taking some action there. And the important thing is that you're moving maybe from the red to the yellow, or from the yellow to the green. So that's one that we hear often, and I think it's a good question to call out.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to piggyback on top of that one as well, is that I get a lot of questions from clients about, well, we've already deployed a business critical application, or we've already deployed something into Azure. Can we re-architect it? Is there a mechanism by which we can do so? Because a lot of my clients come to me and they say, well, it's out there, I can't change it, that just is what it is, and too bad it's not secured, we're going to lose all of our data, whatever. I think one of the biggest myths that I want to dispel is that you can't go back and re-architect a solution. You absolutely can. There's nothing to keep you from evaluating what's been deployed and taking those best practices into account and making changes. To Chris's point earlier, it's not like you have to make a huge change overnight and now you break everything. start looking at, little tweaks. Look at breaking up a monolith into microservices. Look at, enabling active passive capabilities into the app as a starting point before you go active. There are a lot of different ways that you can bite off these 5 pillars and optimizing your workloads without putting any undue stress on a given application or set of applications. So I did want to call that out because it's something that we see a lot of, is being able to refactor some of these apps and modernize them and do it in such a way that it's as minimally disruptive as possible to, once again, your staff or your partners or your customers.
Probably the place that it's hardest to do that is if you haven't defined any of your infrastructure as code, right? And you want to move from UI specified deployment, but you can. Take some work, some scripting. But the other options that you have are to work all those other angles. And then once you're ready with that, okay, now go build your infrastructure from code in a parallel environment, get it to the point where you're ready to deploy it, and then change some config files and point it over, deploy your application back out. Very attainable. And the other side of that is if you're looking at this and you see that you see the benefit of a well-architected application, and maybe you are on premises now and you're saying, okay, I don't see the path from this to well-architected because I'm not even in the cloud yet. Or I see the value of leveraging some cloud platform as a service capabilities, but we're in our on-premises data center and this application's 15 years old. So modernizing this or moving this to the cloud or well-architected is not even on the roadmap until we figure out what that modernization approach is. This is a shameless plug for our application modernization approach that we have here at Netrix. And it may not start with doing a well-architected review of your application because you can tell us right away it's not well-architected because it was written 15 years ago. That is also something to consider is taking a look at your portfolio in its entirety and assessing how to modernize that, assessing what that might look like to modernize it either in your on-premises data center or for the cloud as part of a migration to the cloud. So also a service we offer if simply re-architecting is maybe not as attainable as actually looking and finding out, do we need to take a more drastic or strategic action to modernize our application portfolio? And I think at that, I'll wrap.
Sure. One point there to add is cloud is always having aggregated value, and it's offering us a way to improve a lot of stuff that perhaps we have all methodologies that we are keeping from the past. So the best practices that we can get with this, when we start looking at security, reliability, and performance efficiency, we will see how these points really make a great difference in the way that teams are integrated, in the way that our customers in the site that we have end locations and we need to connect to application and we need faster delivery, we create a big difference. So again, these are important points to give value to our organization and also to identify what are the coming path to grow.
That's perfect. All right. With that, and with those closing remarks, thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Chris, for joining me in this webinar. And thank you, Chris, for the shameless plugs. I'm sure our marketing team will appreciate that. But for everybody who was able to join us today and everybody who's watching this afterwards, thank you so much for joining us. Once again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us and see how we can help you. But thank you, everyone, and have a good one.